Cedar Falls, Night 3 of the blizzard. The National Weather Service called it the coldest evening in 30 years, minus 23 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow had climbed past the porch railings and was still rising. Dorothy Harland was 78 years old, lived alone, had a bad heart, and had already turned off the lights. Then she heard something on the porch. Not the wind, not a branch, something heavy, the sound of a body meeting frozen wood. She opened the door. On the steps lay a man, leather jacket, a skull and wings patch on the back, silver at his temples, lips the color of a bruise. Snow was settling over him slowly, patiently, the way snow settles over things it intends to keep. Any reasonable person would have closed the door and called 911. Dorothy looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she took off her reading glasses, hooked them on her apron, bent down, and grabbed his arm. A 78-year-old woman in minus 23 degrees in the middle of a blizzard, dragging a Hell's Angel through her front door. Nobody knew why she did it. But by morning, the whole town of Cedar Falls would understand. She hadn't just saved a man. She had saved them all. The professional part of Dorothy's brain activated before the frightened part could. Cyanosis of the lips, shallow respiration, less than 10 breaths per minute. Radial pulse weak, irregular, skin cold and waxy to the touch. Stage 3 hypothermia, possibly approaching 4. She had last made these assessments in a field hospital in 1952. Her hands still remembered. "Don't you die on my floor," she told him, not unkindly, hauling him across the threshold by his jacket collar. He was over 200 pounds of dead weight. Her lower back screamed. She ignored it. The paramedics would have used warm force saline, a cardiac monitor, a bear hugger warming blanket. Dorothy had none of that. What she had was 78 years of collected knowledge in a house that had never been short on blankets. Rule 1. Never put a hypothermic patient directly into hot water. Rapid rewarming causes peripheral vasodilation. The cold blood from the extremities floods back to the core. Rewarming shock. It kills people who might otherwise have lived. She had watched it happen once. She had never forgotten. She cut away his wet jacket with her kitchen scissors, no time for zippers, and his soaked thermal shirt beneath it. She worked systematically, the way she had always worked, efficiently, without ceremony, without the luxury of squeamishness. 3 layers of dry wool blankets. 2 hot water bottles wrapped in towels placed at the armpits and groin, where the major blood vessels ran close to the surface. A space heater positioned 6 feet away, close enough to warm the air, far enough to prevent direct heat shock. Then she made sugar water and tilted a little past his lips. His tattoos registered in her peripheral vision as she worked. USMC on the left forearm, the letters dark and slightly faded. Old ink, 15 or 20 years at least. An eagle on the back of his right hand, wings spread as if it were about to take flight. She paused when she saw the Marine Corps abbreviation, just for a moment. "Good boy," she said quietly, to no one in particular. Then she tucked the blanket tighter around his shoulders and checked her watch. 15 minutes until the next temperature check. She was kneeling on the floor beside him, reading his pulse for the 4th time, when he spoke. She almost missed it. His voice was barely there, a cracked whisper that the wind outside nearly swallowed completely. She leaned in close. "They rigged the bike," he said. "They know I have. They know I found it." Then silence. Dorothy sat back on her heels. She looked at his face for a long moment. The old scar on his right cheek. The deep lines around his eyes that spoke of a life lived mostly outdoors. The set of his jaw that even unconsciousness couldn't quite relax. She rose slowly to her feet, one hand on the armchair for support. She crossed the hallway. She stopped in front of the door that her son had once asked her to clean out. "Mom, you don't need all that old paper. Nobody uses paper anymore." She had smiled and changed the subject, as she always did. Now she opened the door to the basement. The archive room took up the entire basement. Floor-to-ceiling metal shelving on every wall. Each shelf labeled in Dorothy's precise, small handwriting. Dates. Categories. Municipal subsections, 1962 through 2003. For decades of Cedar Falls compressed into cardboard and paper and the occasional microfiche reel. Most of it officially no longer existed. When the town had digitized its records in 2004, the originals were slated for destruction. Dorothy had signed the disposal orders. She had also quietly kept copies of anything she deemed significant, which it turned out was quite a lot. Her supervisor at the time had called her meticulous. Her supervisor had not known the half of it. She found the veterans' community files in the third cabinet from the left, 1971 section, exactly where she had placed them 43 years ago. The original land covenant, granted in perpetuity by the county in recognition of service. 22 signatures on the last page in various shades of faded ink. She ran her finger down the list without needing her glasses. Kowalski, third from the bottom. Frank Kowalski. She remembered him, a quiet, serious young man, 24 years old, who had come in to register the deed wearing his discharge papers folded precisely in his chest pocket. She had not known until this moment that the frozen man upstairs was his son. She pulled the 2019 municipal rezoning file next. It took her less than 4 minutes to find the discrepancy. The paperweight was wrong. Modern 80 GSM stock where the original document should have been 70 GSM archival paper. The notary stamp format had changed in 2009, but the refiled original used the post-2009 stamp, and the covenant language, Clause 7 subsection B, had been quietly reworded. The original granted land use in perpetuity. The revised version inserted a single phrase, subject to municipal development review. 3 words buried in a subsection, sufficient, if you had the right lawyers and the right judge, to void everything. Dorothy set both documents on the workbench side by side and stood there in the cold basement light, hands folded, looking at them with an expression that her son would have recognized and found slightly alarming. Meanwhile, on the other side of Cedar Falls, 3 motorcycles were pushing through drifts that had no business being on a road. Lars Eriksson, Viking to anyone who knew him, had been awake since midnight. Gunnar had missed check-in at 11 o'clock. Gunnar did not miss check-ins. Doc found the bike first, half buried in a ditch 2 miles from the county road. He crouched in the snow and examined the engine with a headlamp and the particular focused silence of a man who had once kept people alive in places where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride away. "This isn't mechanical," he said. Viking stood behind him. "What is it?" Something was introduced into the fuel system. Something that would cause failure in sustained low temperatures. Doc straightened. This was engineered. The word hung in the frozen air. Biscuit behind them stopped talking for what was possibly the first time all evening. Viking looked at the ditch. He looked at the dark road stretching ahead. His jaw set in a way that the people who underestimated him, and there were many, because he encouraged them, would not have recognized. "Find him," he said. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Dorothy picked up her telephone, the old rotary-style landline that her son had been trying to replace for a decade, and called Martha Briggs, who had lived 3 streets over for 35 years and who knew everyone in Cedar Falls worth knowing. "Martha," she said, "I need the contact information for the local Hells Angels chapter. Don't ask questions." A pause. "Dorothy, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm aware of that. Do you have it or don't you?" At 6:45, she had a number. At 6:46, she had Viking on the phone. At 7, when she came upstairs to check on her patient, she found him awake. He was lying very still, the way soldiers and fighters lie still, she knew, assessing surroundings before moving, watching her with gray eyes that were quiet and sharp and somewhat confused. The confusion, she suspected, was not a medical symptom. Dorothy sat down in the chair beside the bed and picked up her knitting. The bowl of congee on the nightstand was still steaming. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice was hoarse. "My home." She turned her needles without looking up. "You owe me a rug. You soaked mine clean through." He stared at her for a long moment. "You dragged me inside," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "You weren't going to do it yourself." Another silence. He seemed to be recalibrating something. "You should have called." The nearest ambulance in a Category 3 blizzard would have arrived in approximately 2 hours, Dorothy said pleasantly. "You had perhaps 45 minutes. Eat your congee before it cools." He looked at the bowl. He looked at her. Then carefully, he sat up and reached for it. The knock at Dorothy's door at 9:15 that morning was the kind of knock that could have been mistaken for a structural inspection. She opened the door and looked up, some considerable distance up, at a blond man the approximate dimensions of a refrigerator, flanked by a lean, watchful figure and a younger man who appeared to be vibrating with suppressed energy. "You hear about the man in the leather jacket?" she said. Viking blinked. "Yes, ma'am. Come in. Mind the mat, I just mopped. There's congee on the stove. Help yourself." The three men filed into her small living room with the careful, slightly stricken expressions of people who were worried about knocking something over. Doc sat precisely on the edge of the sofa. Viking remained standing, mostly because there was no chair that looked architecturally suited to him. Biscuit, reaching out to steady himself on a side table, accidentally nudged a small porcelain figurine. He caught it. He went pale. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. It's a replica. Says made in China on the bottom. I paid $8 for it at a garage sale." Dorothy took it from his hands and set it back. "Sit down." The tension in the room dissolved like sugar in hot water. Gunnar had made his way downstairs, moving slowly but steadily, and when he appeared in the doorway, the exchange between him and Viking required no words. Viking's eyes did a rapid top-to-bottom assessment, checking for damage, and whatever he found satisfied him. The two men clasped hands briefly, and that was that. Doc was already beside Gunnar, fingers at his wrist, asking quiet questions. "Cracked rib," he concluded. "Bruising consistent with a beating before the abandonment. Dorothy had prevented any organ damage." "You were lucky," Doc said. "I was in the right place," Gunnar said, and glanced toward the kitchen where Dorothy was calmly ladling congee. Then Dorothy came back into the room and placed two files on the coffee table. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked at Gunnar. "Your father's name is Frank Kowalski," she said. It wasn't a question. He went very still. He came into the municipal records office in September of 1971 to register the Veterans Community Land Covenant. He was 24 years old. He wore his discharge papers in his chest pocket. She touched the edge of the older document. "This is the original." She touched the second. "This is what the town currently has on file." Gunnar leaned forward. He studied both pages in silence. The room was quiet enough that the clock on the mantel was audible. The difference, once Dorothy pointed to Clause 7, was not subtle. "They changed it," he said. "They changed it." He looked up. "How did you know I was looking for this?" Dorothy removed her glasses and polished them on her apron, a gesture that in 4 decades of record-keeping had preceded some of her most definitive statements. "Because your father's name is on this document," she said, "and I remember every person who ever signed anything in my office. That is all." She put her glasses back on. Gunnar was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that wasn't emptiness. "He found the discrepancy 3 weeks before he died," Gunnar finally said. "He left me a note. I didn't understand it at first. He left me one, too," Dorothy said. She rose, went to the kitchen drawer, and brought back a small folded piece of paper, worn at the creases. "He put it through my mail slot 3 years ago. I didn't understand his meaning at the time. Now I do." Gunnar unfolded it. "Read it." His face didn't change, but his hands, Dorothy noticed, were absolutely steady as he folded the paper and placed it in his chest pocket, exactly where his father used to keep his discharge papers. Richard Holt had been awake since 7. His phone had not stopped. The ski resort developers were calling. His lawyers were calling. His personal assistant was calling. And beneath all of it, like a current of cold water, was the single fact that Cole Marsh had delivered to him at 6:50 a.m. "Kowalski is alive." "How?" Holt said, in the tone he used when the answer he received was unacceptable. "Does a man survive being left in -23 degrees weather for 4 hours? Cole's voice over the phone was the same as it always was. Level, unstrained, professional. It was the quality Holt valued most about him. Cole didn't rattle. Cole didn't make things personal. Cole solved problems. Apparently, he was found by a local resident. An elderly woman, Dorothy Harland, lives on Birchwood Street. Is she a problem? A pause that lasted precisely 1 second longer than Cole's pauses usually did. She was the municipal archivist for 40 years, Cole said. The silence that followed was Holt's. "Get the documents," he said finally. "Whatever she has, the original covenant, anything related to the rezoning. She lives alone. She's old. The roads are still half closed, and her neighbors aren't going anywhere." His voice had recovered its smoothness. "Be discreet. You're good at discreet. Consider it done." Holt hung up and turned back to his window, looking out over a Cedar Falls made pristine and silent by 3 days of snow. He thought about the resort. 18 holes, 4-star lodge, a spa. The kind of destination that would put this town on the map in a way that a bunch of aging veterans in prefab houses never would. He had been so close. He straightened his tie. He was still close. 3 miles away, Biscuit was sitting in Dorothy's kitchen, eating his second bowl of congee and talking to a contact on his phone with the ease of someone conducting a perfectly ordinary conversation. He had been, as Viking sometimes said, terrifyingly good at this since the age of about 14. At 12:15, he came into the living room, phone in hand, with the expression of someone about to place a card on the table. Cole Marsh, he said, former CFPD, fired for excessive force in 2017. Started a private security firm in 2018. 3 weeks ago, Holt Development Group subsidiary, it's called Lakeview Properties LLC, paid Cole's firm $38,000 for consulting services. Viking raised an eyebrow. What kind of consulting? Gunnar said it was not a question. The kind that gets your motorcycle fuel system chemically compromised before a midnight ride in a blizzard, Biscuit said. The room was quiet. Dorothy, who had been reading at her kitchen table, appeared in the doorway. She said nothing. She simply looked at Gunnar with the expression of a woman confirming a calculation she had already made. There's a car at the end of the street, she said. Gray sedan. It's been there since 10:30. Same driver, hasn't moved. Everyone in the room looked at her. I noticed when I went to check the mailbox, she said. I used to be a records clerk, not an invalid. She turned back, toward the kitchen. I imagine your friends will need dinner. I have a pot of soup on. Viking watched her go. Gunnar, he said quietly, she stays safe. I know, Gunnar said again. He looked toward the kitchen doorway. Something shifted in his expression, something that had no name, but was adjacent to the feeling of a debt that couldn't be measured in any currency he understood. He went into the kitchen and, without being asked, began drying the dishes she'd left in the rack. Dorothy noticed. She said nothing. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket and slid it across the counter. This is what I found in the 2019 rezoning file, she said. Specific discrepancies noted by page and line. The paper stock differential, the notary stamp anachronism, the altered covenant language. She paused. If someone with legal standing were to present this to a federal court alongside the original document, the rezoning order would not survive review. Gunnar set down the dish towel. You prepared this? He said. Before we even arrived. I prepared it before I called about your friends, she said. I had some time this morning while you were sleeping. He looked at her, really looked. The white hair pinned back, the ink stain on her apron, the gold-rimmed glasses that she wore like armor. Why, he said. Dorothy considered the question with apparent seriousness. Because your father signed that document, she said. And I was the one who filed it, which means I am in some small way responsible for what happens to it. She went back to her soup. Eat something, she said. You look terrible. They came at 2 o'clock in the morning. Cole had chosen the time deliberately, not midnight, which was too theatrical. People expected trouble at midnight. 2 a.m. was the hour of deep sleep, of lowered guard, of the body's resistance at its minimum. He had 3 men. He expected 1 injured biker, 1 old woman, and a problem that would be resolved in under 10 minutes. The porch light was off when they came up the walk. The house was dark and silent. Cole reached the front door and was just assessing the lock when the porch light came on. The door opened. Viking filled the frame. Behind him, through the gap, Cole could see Doc standing with complete stillness in the hallway, and beyond Doc, the warm glow of the living room where an old woman sat in a rocking chair with a cup of tea, as though this were a perfectly ordinary hour to be drinking tea. Cole's 2 men moved toward the flanks and found them already occupied. The fight, such as it was, lasted less than 90 seconds. Viking was the kind of large that moved faster than large things should move. The 2 flanking men, trained for intimidation rather than resistance, found themselves outmatched in ways they hadn't been paid to handle. Cole stepped back. Gunnar came around the corner of the porch. He was moving carefully, the rib, but his face was the face of a man doing something that required no effort at all. Cole recognized the type. He'd once been the type himself, before he'd learned that it was more profitable not to care. You're trespassing, Cole said. I could have you and your entire club. Gunnar held up his phone. The screen showed a text message time-stamped 43 minutes ago. A phone number Cole recognized. It belonged to Patty Gwynn, who wrote for the Cedar Falls Courier and whose father had lived in the veterans community for 30 years. 3 hours ago, Gunnar said, a friend of mine sent Miss Gwynn the payment records between Holt Development and your firm, the original land covenant, the altered 2019 filing, and a photo of your car that has been parked on this street since 10:30 this morning." He lowered the phone. "The article goes live at 6 a.m. unless she hears otherwise from me." Cole said nothing. "You came here tonight to take documents," Gunnar said. "The documents are already out." The silence stretched. Cole Marsh, who had spent 15 years mastering the art of being the most dangerous person in any room, took one very measured breath. He looked at his two men, one of whom was sitting on the porch steps holding his jaw, and the other of whom was in the flower bed, which was under 3 feet of snow. He looked at Viking, who was watching him with the patient interest of a man who had already decided what happened next, and was simply waiting. He turned and walked away. No threat, no parting line, just the sound of his footsteps on the frozen path. And then, after a moment, the engine of the gray sedan. Dorothy's front porch fell quiet. Biscuit exhaled. "Holy," Dorothy said from the living room without raising her voice. "Moly," Biscuit finished, somewhat unconvincingly. He came to the living room doorway and looked at her. She was sitting in her rocking chair, cup of tea in both hands, the same way she'd been sitting when Cole first looked through the window. She hadn't moved the whole time. "Were you scared?" he asked. Dorothy thought about this genuinely, tilting her head slightly to one side. "I was 22 years old," she said, "and I performed a field amputation in a tent in Korea with a man screaming and no anesthesia left and shells landing close enough to rattle the instruments." She took a sip of tea. "After that, I find most things are manageable." Biscuit stared at her. "You are the most terrifying person I have ever met," he said, with what sounded like honest reverence. Dorothy smiled. It was small and dry and somewhat pleased. "Sit down," she said. "I'll put the kettle on." Outside, Gunnar stood on the porch. The snow had stopped falling sometime around midnight, and the air was so cold and so still that the world had gone crystalline, every surface coated in ice that caught the distant light and scattered it in fragments. He swept the steps. He had found her broom in the corner of the porch earlier, and he used it now, methodically clearing the steps where he had fallen 4 nights ago, working from the top down, his breath clouding in the cold air. The cracked rib complained. He ignored it. When he was done, he stood there for a moment. The town was silent, buried, sleeping. He thought about his father, 24 years old, walking into a records office in 1971, discharge papers folded in his chest pocket. He thought about the note his father had left, the small folded paper now resting against his sternum. He thought about an old woman who had kept 40 years of documents that no one had asked her to keep, and who had spent a morning she could have used to rest finding the exact fault line in a structure of lies. He put the broom back in the corner. He went inside. At the back of the hall, Sheriff Dale Oaks stood with his arms at his sides, watching. He had read the article that morning. He had read it twice. He had sat in his office for an hour and a half thinking about the years he had spent looking away from things he understood but chose not to act on. About the phone calls from Holt's office that had shaped what did and did not get investigated. About the veterans he knew personally, men he'd grown up with, men who'd been getting slowly displaced, and what he had said to himself to explain not doing anything about it. He had come to this press conference telling himself he was only here to observe. His hand moved to his badge. He walked forward through the crowd. The sky on the 4th day after the blizzard was the particular blue that only comes after extended snowfall. Deep, impossible, so saturated with cold clarity that it seemed to be trying to compensate for the days of gray. Every surface in Cedar Falls was white and hard and blazing. Cole Marsh was arrested at 6 a.m. by federal agents cooperating with Sheriff Oaks, who had called in every resource he had, and a few he technically hadn't been authorized to request. Richard Holt was taken from his home at 8:15, in full view of his neighbors, still in his bathrobe, and with his famous hair uncombed for the first time in documented public memory. Glenn Price's testimony, secured the previous afternoon, had provided the structural foundation for charges that a federal judge would within 36 hours describe as among the more cleanly documented municipal corruption cases his court had reviewed in a decade. The veterans' community land seizure order was suspended by federal injunction at 9 o'clock. Dorothy heard about it on the radio while she made breakfast. She turned the radio off and kept making breakfast. He turned toward the bikes. The engine started, a sequence, low to high, like a chord resolving. Dorothy stood on her porch with her hands folded over her apron. She watched them move down the street one by one through the brilliant white morning. She watched Gunnar take the lead, the eagle on his right hand catching the light as his hand turned on the throttle. The last bike slowed. Viking, enormous and improbable on his machine, drew level with the Porch. He looked at her, this small woman with her gold-rimmed glasses and her flour-dusted apron and her spine like a steel rod, and he lowered his chin in a bow that was somehow entirely sincere. Dorothy nodded back. He rode on. She watched them until the sound of the engines faded into the cold, clear air, and the street was quiet and white and still. Then she went inside. She locked the door. She hung her apron on its hook. She went to the kitchen and heated the last of the congee from the pot on the stove and sat down at her small kitchen table in the winter morning light and ate her breakfast. Outside, Cedar Falls was waking up to a different day than the one it had expected. There were phone calls being made and articles being read and conversations being had on front steps and in grocery stores and in the veterans community, where men who had spent months in uncertainty were hearing for the first time in a long time that something had gone right. Dorothy ate her congee. She rinsed her bowl. She went downstairs to the archive room, where 2 document cases sat open on the workbench, their contents now legally submitted, photographed, and in the custody of the Federal District Office. The shelves around her held everything else. For decades of a town's life, the accumulated record of promises made and kept and broken. The kind of history that only survives because someone decided it was worth the bother of keeping. She stood in the middle of it for a moment. Then she began methodically to tidy the files she'd pulled out in the night. She had always believed that the most important work was the kind that no one noticed. The kind that happened at midnight and 4 in the morning, and in drafty basements, and in records rooms that smelled of old paper. The work of maintenance. The work of holding things in place. She filed the last folder. She turned off the light. She went upstairs to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and sat down to read the morning paper. It was a very good morning paper. 3 months later, the Veterans Community Land Covenant was formally reaffirmed by the county in a ceremony attended by 47 veterans, their families, 2 federal officials, and 1 reporter from the Cedar Falls Courier. Dorothy Harland was offered a seat of honor at the front. She declined, saying she preferred to stand near the back, where she could see everyone. Nobody argued with her.